This week, Dan Benjamin from Dig Security is with us to discuss data security in the cloud. Then Paddy Harrington from Forrester joins us to talk about IoT security. Finally, in the enterprise security news, cyber insurance is doing better, but still a mess. 3 new cybersecurity startups, 7 new fundings, including a $100 million Series B for Sierra, 2 acquisitions, 2 hot takes, 24 companies destroyed by a breach. IronNet drama intensifies. Is the SEC taking the wheel? Valence's 2023 State of SaaS report. That's where I work. And a camera without a lens. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
The cybersecurity landscape is full of single solution providers, making it easy for unexpected cyber threats to sneak through the cracks. That's why Forrester is creating a stronger, simpler strategy for protection, one that increases your security maturity while decreasing the operational burden that comes with it. This is all possible thanks to Forrester's best-in-class portfolio and deep bench of expert problem solvers. Forrester's integrated, scalable solutions help customers face their toughest challenges with confidence. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Fortra, Fortra. Do the words free time or relaxation sound foreign to you? Perhaps you've been stuck in the office too long, battling cyber threats or worrying about the next strain of ransomware. Let Sophos help provide peace of mind 24/7, 365 with cybersecurity delivered as a service. Because we want you to get back to your weekends, family dinners, and everything in between. And you'll get there with Sophos. Visit securityweekly.com/Sophos to learn more. When organizations face poor web performance, challenges building modern applications at scale, or need to reduce operational and development costs, they turn to Fastly. Fastly's distributed edge network means your business can unleash its growth potential without worrying about scaling your infrastructure, whether for growth of users, transaction volume, or geographic expansion. Get the speed, security, and edge cloud innovation you need to deliver profitable and engaging experiences. Visit securityweekly.com/Fastly for more information or to speak to an expert. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy National Handshake Day. This is episode 322, recorded on Thursday, June 29th, 2023. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the Czar of Zero Trust, the captain of content, the reformed analyst, Katie Teitler. How are you, Katie?
I'm well, but I do wish the handshake would die. It's kind of gross. It's always been kind of gross. There are other better ways to say hello to people and greet people and be excited to see them without shaking hands.
Yeah, it's deeply ingrained in a lot of cultures, but that was actually something I was going to bring up after going to RSA this year. I'd say probably 10 to 20% of the handshake opportunities were dead. Like people were just not willing to handshake anymore. There were elbow bumps, there were fist bumps. So yeah, I think you might get your wish, Katie. I think it's getting to that point.
I really thought that COVID would finally do away with the handshake. And if I know you well and I'm comfortable with you, hey, I'll give you a hug if it's the appropriate situation. But I think handshakes in particular, and when you go to conferences, when you go to other public places where you're touching things that a lot of other people that you don't know and who might not have a certain sense of hygiene I think it's important. And sorry to go off on a hygiene issue, but I'm also all about security hygiene, so it ties in there, right?
Yeah, there's some guys out there where it's just like a test your strength type of thing. Like you go in for the handshake and you're like, oh, okay, it's going to be one of these, huh? Like
I've always hated that.
I got to squeeze really hard, huh?
Always hated that.
And that is the Baron of Bloodhound, the Pirate King of PowerShell, Sean Metcalf. How you doing, Sean?
Hey, Adrian, doing good. Coming off of a week off of ESW and time with family, which is always nice. But yeah, about the handshake. I'm with Katie on this. I think that the handshake has always been kind of an awkward thing, and a lot of times you social convention says you shake hands. I think it's National Handshake Day, but I also think it's National Adrian Let the Hair Out Day. So.
His flowing locks.
I did wash my hair not too long ago, so yeah, it's actually still drying. I don't put it up when it's still drying, so you get to enjoy it being down.
It looks great.
One last thing on handshakes. I remember the first time I traveled to the Middle East. I'm not paranoid, but I do a lot of research before I do something like that. And the reason we're going meant I had to do even more research. So in the culture, like I knew handshakes were an integral thing, and that and to expect the handshake to last a very long time, like possibly the length of an entire conversation. So you could be holding that handshake for 5 minutes, 15 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. My first handshake when I met our point of contact over in Bahrain, when I was over there to do to do a full red team for an organization. That was the longest handshake of my life. It was
wow. That's impressive.
Like, face to face, looking into somebody's eyes, holding their hand for 15 minutes. It's intense. And
it's a close handshake, right? You're right in their space. It's like, hi, let's have a conversation from about a foot apart. I've definitely been in conversations like that. And I think a lot of it's cultural. I mean, Katie mentions hygiene, security. Certainly there's different boundaries of spacing based on culture as well. Not just, do you shake hands or not, but also how close are you to the person when you're talking? So I imagine you were pretty close as you're engaged and locked in hand-to-hand grip as you're having a close conversation, right?
And it's apparently rude to try and pull your hand away. So you have to resist that urge the entire time. And after a while, it's just like, yeah, whatever, those impulses pass after like the first 30 seconds or so. But yeah, it was funny because some of the stuff I researched, just absolute BS, like didn't find it at all. And then the other half. So I had no idea. It was rolling the dice every time. I was very careful about everything I did. I didn't want to insult anybody. But yeah, the handshake thing is real in the Middle East.
What was one of the biggest myths?
Oh, like showing the bottom, like crossing your legs, showing the bottom of your foot. And it could be that in different parts of the Middle East, it's different. We do have, I haven't introduced Dan Benjamin yet, but we do have somebody who probably knows some of these better than I do. But yeah, thumbs up was another one. It was like thumbs up is an offensive gesture. And I get to Bahrain and rent a car, and we're driving to the hotel, and they have these lotteries over there, and there's billboards everywhere, with a guy holding like a wad of cash and like giving a thumbs up with the other hand. I'm like, okay, so clearly some of what I researched is not correct. The internet,
or maybe thumbs up means you have money.
Yeah, I don't know. It looked very much like a Western, like, hey, I'm having a good time. This is a good deal. You should do it. Thumbs up. But all right, let's move on from handshakes. Quick announcement here. You can now find us on Instagram. Follow us for highlight reels, giveaway announcements, and more at Sec Weekly. And I believe we're Sec Weekly on Twitter as well. So usually we're either Security Weekly or Sec Weekly. Yeah, there it is. If you're looking at this, we have a few visual cues going on for folks listening to the audio-only version of this. All right. For our first interview, today's topic is data security in the cloud. We're excited to have Dan Benjamin with us today. Dan is the co-founder and CEO at Dig Security. He's an entrepreneur with over a decade of industry experience, has held leadership roles at Microsoft and Google, which is where he spotted a gap in public cloud data security solutions, which led him to co-found Dig. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and before, I apologize for all the puns, but before we dig in, I would love to hear your insight on handshakes in the Middle East.
First off, I'm a hugger. I mean, in Israel, we hug. So whenever we meet someone new and we like them, they get a hug. I'm not a big fan of the handshakes, especially not long handshakes. That's a little bit claustrophobic for me, but new people get a hug from me. So I'm a hugger.
Yeah, and that's something I had to learn also, is that not everybody's a hugger. So I've had a few awkward hugs where I realized I imposed a hug on someone who really did not, want to have full body contact with me.
I just did that at a recent someone that from my past that I saw that I've been out with socially, just the two of us, hadn't seen in a couple of years, and this person came up and I gave this person a great big enthusiastic hug, and at the end of the conversation, as they were leaving, they reached out to give me a handshake, and I thought, oh, whoops.
Yeah, I've had a few of those awkward moments. So Dan, let's I promise I'm not gonna do too many dig puns. It's very
you
difficult.
Have to use the actual dig puns. Let's dig in. I dig security. I mean, we use them all the time.
I can dig it.
Oh boy. All right. Let's go. So in the intro, I mentioned your background at Microsoft, and what was it that you were seeing that kind of inspired you to, or made you notice the gap here, and inspired you to found a company that focuses on this space?
Of course. So at Microsoft, I initially led SaaS security. So I led the actual Microsoft CASB, MCAS, or now Microsoft Defender for Cloud Applications. And after that, switched over to essentially lead the multi-cloud security strategy at Microsoft. So how does Microsoft become AWS security and GCP security? And as we were crafting what does multi-cloud security even mean, I started interviewing a lot of customers. I think I interviewed approximately 50 of the Fortune 500 in a period of a couple of months. And every single one of those customers kept repeating the same exact questions around data. What data do I even own across my clouds? We started migrating across AWS and Azure and GCP and Snowflake, and we have kind of all of this information that we ported from the on-prem into the cloud, and we just don't understand what do we have in our clouds. Second, how is that data being used? Which applications, users, vendors, contractors are touching which pieces of information? And lastly, how do I protect this information? I used to have DLP controls in the on-prem. I used to have DLP controls in the endpoints. I basically have nothing in the cloud. And as we all see today, 50% of data breaches are happening in the cloud. We're going to see more and more because more data is being migrated into the cloud. We're at this tipping point that there's now more data in public clouds versus on-prem. And we just have zero controls. And I didn't see any good solution that was essentially built either at Microsoft or at AWS or at Google Cloud. And I didn't see anything that spanned across multiple clouds. So I decided to build it myself. And I partnered up with two of my good friends, Ido and Gad, and we built a company. We wanted to essentially dig into this problem space. I had to use the pun as well. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, we're not going to put any restrictions on puns. I've decided for this episode. It's just
on this show you can't.
It's just too hard. It's too hard. But yeah. So back when I was an industry analyst at 451 Research, I predicted that data security would be one of the last problems that we would tackle. Just because it's so difficult to put controls around data, to classify data. It just seemed like a really hard problem, and I predicted we were going to tackle all the the lower hanging fruit first, and I feel like we're pretty much at that point where there's at least, maybe it's not the best solution, but just about everywhere else in security, there is a market. Any kind of asset. Any space where security is needed, there's some product out there. We've got over 4,000 vendors, enterprise B2B security vendors these days. And so do you feel like this was something where the technology had to get to a certain point for us to be able to tackle this first, or was it more that founders just and it's not like we didn't have DLP, but classic DLP, people don't have fond thoughts of their previous DLP solutions. So why now, I guess, is the question. Has technology gotten us to a point to where we can do this better than we could 10 years ago? Or is it basically the same challenges, and with the benefit of hindsight, we can come at it better?
Wow, that's a big question, and I think there's multiple answers here. But I would start with kind of a couple of different factors. So first off, I think the pain has just gotten bigger, right? On-prem, we used to use 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of data stores. A typical enterprise today running in a public cloud has 30 or 40 different types of data stores on thousands, if not tens of thousands of instances. So everything just got multiplied when we started getting into the cloud, when we started moving into microservices, when we started having multiple deployment models, right? We used to have only IaaS data stores. Now you have PaaS services, and you have databases as a service like Snowflake and Atlas and Databricks. So first off, the problem just got intensified. The fragmentation got so much higher. Second, of course, we have tons of data regulations. So we initially started with kind of Sarbanes-Oxley and PCI and HIPAA, but now we, of course, have GDPR in Europe that essentially catapulted kind of privacy regulations around data all over the globe. So we have CCPA in California today, and we're talking kind of about a federal law in the US. We have LGPD in Brazil. We have the Indian data law that is now coming in. So multiple privacy laws and the FTC safeguards. So a lot of controls that are mandated by the governments to essentially control data and put better protections. And lastly, the actual technology made it easier. I don't know if you've ever used kind of an older data security product. I would call these Gen 1. I don't know if you ever use like a Varonis or a Big ID or those kind of older products. But those products mandated you to essentially manually connect thousands of data stores into a product. And that made those types of data security projects cumbersome. They made them long. You had to put multiple FTEs to just maintain a specific security product.
A lot of overhead.
I think that the technology, tons. And today in the public clouds, you can essentially span and classify and categorize and visualize all your data in less than 24 hours. You essentially plug into the cloud, and with the ability to essentially create snapshots and backups and exports and essentially do this kind of analysis of data stores automatically instead of manually connecting data stores, it's phenomenal. Organizations today that have kind of switched from Gen 1 to Gen 2 are seeing value in less than a day. This is unheard of in data security up until 2 years ago. So I'm super excited about the actual category. I think it was underserved for many, many, many years. And now we can essentially bring it home, and we can build bigger and faster and actually allow organizations to better control data.
Yeah, Kate, I think Katie had a question.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, a lot of this didn't become possible until about 2 years ago, but also about 2 years ago, every new company, every entrepreneur and their brother, sister, cousin, grandmother decided that DSPM is a super hot space and they want to go into it. What challenges does that create for you as an entrepreneur, founder, product developer, marketer? You're doing it all right now since you're a startup. So what are the challenges there for you in this space that a lot of people are jumping into?
I actually think it's fantastic, to be honest. We're building a new category. And I always say that you need between 8 to 10 competitors to build a good category. We're all essentially educating the market and, well, this is a big thing. This is something that we need to put focus on. We're all marketing the same thing. And we're all trying to help organizations better protect their information. So first off, market awareness came to this market super quickly. When we started the company, it was the end of 2021. most organizations didn't put data security as top 3 priority. Talk to most organizations today, data security is top 1 priority. You see kind of the Gartner reports. Gartner reports say that 20% of all enterprises are going to have a DSPM technology by end of 2025. This category was born 9 months ago. I mean, officially born 9 months ago. So kind of moving from no category at all to all enterprises are going to have DSPM, or 20% of enterprises are going to have DSPM by the end of 2025. It's phenomenal. And this is just because we have multiple vendors in the category. But then it's, of course, a game of execution. Who can bring this product to market in a better fashion? Who can build a good culture and a good technology that essentially solve this problem better than others? So I think it's better to operate in a category that has multiple competitors versus operating in a category that doesn't. So I'm grateful to have my peers try to solve this problem as well.
It's true. You don't want to be in a category by yourself, because then there's always the fear, does nobody want this? Can nobody use this?
Category. Yeah, and it's interesting, not to throw shade or anything, but one of those categories that I'm very skeptical about is the enterprise browser market. And to your to your point about what Gartner is predicting here, Dan, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a company that doesn't have this problem. So this was very much a market that was the only reason they weren't searching or buying something is just because it wasn't there. So the moment you started filling that vacuum, absolutely I can see the interest in it. But yeah, definitely. So we've had some other folks, some other founders from other DSPMs on, and it's interesting to see how they view the market, because some are not exclusively cloud focused. Some are building their products for on-prem, for cloud. There are different approaches to it. Obviously, data's just such a generic thing. There are many different ways that you can approach it. There's some things that everybody has to do, though, right? Like you have to find the data, and you have to figure out what that data is. Again, you mentioned all the legislation going on. Some data applies to some of that legislation. Some, whether you're talking PCI, I forget the Brazilian one that's like
LGBT.
LGBT. Like you've got to classify all that data, and then you've got to I don't know. Back when I was a PCI QSA, the difficult thing that we always had to do is figure out the data flow diagram, right? Like we had to identify the data and figure out how it got from point A to point Z. And I wonder if any of these products are doing that, or how you approach this so it's consumable by your customers, where it's not overwhelming. You're talking about the overhead with things like Varonis and some of the more traditional legacy data protection products out there.
Yeah, so I think ease of use is probably the most important thing today in cybersecurity. I think if you don't build products that your consumers like to consume on a daily basis or a weekly basis, depending on the product itself, you're not going to do well in the markets. So first off, understanding that you need to build something that is easy is super important. So our product essentially looks at this in phases. You got it exactly right. First off, we have to essentially discover any type of data store that lives in the customer's environment. So it can be past data stores, anything that essentially is managed by the cloud, like an RDS and an Azure SQL and a Google BigQuery. And that is something that you essentially discover through APIs, but you also have VMs running a data store. How do you find that a developer booted up a MySQL running on Linux? Or how do you find that a developer booted up an MS SQL running on Windows? So you also need to find those, and we have a really cool technology that allows us to discover all of these different types of data stores automatically. Once we discover them, we need to, of course, classify the information. And then you also have a little split, right? Because you have unstructured data, which is files in buckets and file shares. You have structured data, and it can be anything like relational databases. And you have semi-structured data storage like DynamoDB and MongoDB and Cosmos. And there we essentially have a really cool technology that allows us to, of course, take either a backup, an export, or a snapshot, analyze the information on a replica of the actual data store itself. So without actually adding load into the actual customer's database. So we discover, we classify the data itself, but then you need to bring in context on top of the data. So first off, of course, where do we have PII or PHI or PCI or any type of regulated data? Where do we have sensitive data just to us as an organization? We need to understand and bring in this business context, this organizational context into the data. How is data flowing inside the organization? Who has access to it? Am I compliant both with my business regulations, but also with my privacy regulations? Where do I have data exposure or data risk? And lastly, our goal is to also protect the data. So DIG is very unique in that aspect of it in our market. We coined the term data detection and response, which essentially says we're still going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of people, machines, vendors, contractors. All of those are going to have access to this information. So even if we have fantastic posture, we're still going to need to essentially protect data by those that essentially have access to it. So I might have an encrypted S3 bucket with tons of sensitive information, but it's encrypted and I think I'm safe. But then you'll have a machine that get compromised and someone will do a mass download or copy all the information out to a different cloud or copy the information to an FTP or do a mass encryption like ransomware. So we always need to also look in real time what's actually happening with this information. And that's where data detection response comes in. Gartner is now also including it into this category as well. And the goal here is to implement DLP-like controls into the public cloud and to be able to identify what should never happen with data and also how do we detect and how do we respond to these types of events. So essentially combining both the data security posture management side of it, discovery, classification, risk analysis, but also the real-time aspects of it. Very similar to what happened in kind of CSPM and workload protection that eventually merged into Synapse.
So, a few questions about, so AWS does have a product, that can do some data classification. They've got Macy. Is this something that you leverage, or, how do you handle that question when you're talking to prospects and they're asking, why wouldn't we just use this? I mean, I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but would like to hear your take on that, how you handle those questions.
Of course. So first off, Macy is only for unstructured data. So it only handles buckets. You need to manually trigger it, and it will scan a specific bucket for sensitive information.
So it's
Macy,
S3?
Yeah, just S3. Now, most environments today, even if they run in a single cloud, will have 20 different types of data stores. So right. Covering 1/20th of your data is not a good thing. Also, most customers are running multi-cloud. So then you need to double or triple the variety of data assets that you also need to scan and analyze. Now, you don't want to run Macy on one cloud and Google Cloud AP and Google Cloud and Purview just on Azure. You essentially want a system that will span across any type of cloud that you essentially have and across any type of data store that you have. And lastly, you want it to be efficient and affordable. I always say that classification is a combination of kind of three main important factors. First off, price. If it's too expensive, you're not going to run it. Second, of course, is speed. How long will it take you to essentially classify the information? How quickly can you distribute this across the organization? And lastly, of course, is accuracy. Because if the results are not good, then you're not going to use the product. And I think AWS Macy kind of lacked on all of those aspects of it. Speed is actually not bad, but the accuracy and cost is just too expensive for most organizations. And then, of course, coverage.
And I imagine, so all the DSPMs we've talked to, because this data is sensitive, it would get very complicated if you pulled this back into, your cloud enclaves to do the classification. So I assume you're doing that classification within the customer's area. So there's something that they have to deploy, containers or EC2 instances, something like that to run that classifier engine. Is that correct?
Correct. We essentially do all the data analysis in the customer's environments. So we don't copy any data out. We don't see the customer's information, of course. And there's also kind of another factor there that you actually need to do the data analysis and data classification in the customer's region. So whenever you do that data analysis, if let's say they're a multinational brand, and we have many of those using the data security platform, then let's say they're operating right now in 15 regions. Every time you classify information of a specific region, you need to classify that in that specific region. Otherwise, you're breaking data residency.
Right.
So there's multiple challenges in data classification in customers' environments. But I think Dig cracked it quite well. Basically, our implementation takes a couple minutes. You just deploy a couple of roles, and Dig will do that orchestration for the data classification for the customer. So the customer doesn't need to actually deploy a container or deploy VMs. That's very hard for organizations typically to manage. So all they need to do is deploy a couple of roles, and Dig will do that data classification orchestration in the customer's environment automatically.
So trying to think about the process the customer will go through when using your product. Your product draws attention to something that looks potentially bad. We're talking about the data detection and response process here. Certainly for incident response, for asset management especially, and part of this is like asset management, discovering your data and understanding how that data is used and who's using it. Can you make it easier for somebody to figure out who the asset owner is for the data? Say like the thing you're looking at that looks suspicious. It's just an application owner or a service account, or you just see Kubernetes doing something that it doesn't look like that account should be doing or doesn't normally do. Like how do you make that process easier for the customer?
Excellent question. So first off, we kind of split this into two components. So in DSPM, there's a component called data access governance. Who has access to what data stores and to what pieces of information? And that's kind of who can do something, right? Who can read something and who can write something. But because Dig also looks at real-time activity of the actual data stores, and that's kind of the data detection response component, then we also have who is using that information. And we put these two layers on top of each other. And that gives us really interesting insights. So first off, not only we know who has access, but we also know who can access which pieces of information across any type of data store that is deployed in the customer's cloud. Now, data ownership is a difficult challenge, right? There is no magic here. I always used to say that in the Army, we used to have something called the scream test. I was in the 8200 unit 20 years ago. And whenever we had a server and we didn't know who owned it, we just unplugged it from the electricity and saw who screamed, right? So that was the scream test in the Army. In the cloud, you can't really do something like that. But you can see which identities, which machines, which applications are using.
Sure, you can. You can do that in the cloud. It's just not going to end well.
Exactly. Or you're going to get fired. So in the cloud, we can see who's actually touching this piece of information, which applications, users, and vendors. So at least you have the first hop of who to go to versus kind of just drawing a blank and seeing, okay, I have this data store. Now who do I ask? So sometimes we can derive context from the business units if they have the right tags. And sometimes we can derive the context from who created the type of data store, who's interacting with the type of data store, or from the pieces of information that live inside. But there is no magic for data ownership. It's a big challenge. And lastly, sometimes organizations already have a data catalog inside the organization. They implemented Equilibra or Annihilation in the past, and we can pull that context from there. Now, in terms of verifying the identity itself, then of course we plug into the cloud IAM so we can understand the different identities. And if there's federation, we also plug into the customer's IDP. So whether it is Active Directory and Okta and Ping, and we can pull in additional information so we can enrich the identity that is now doing the actions.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, Sean, I think you had a question.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry. I was just processing what you said, Ben. It makes a lot of sense, and it ties into my next question, or my question here, certainly about data ownership and how it's managed. One challenge that's been around for years is ensuring that the correct people has rights to the specific data files that they should have access to, but not anyone else. I've seen file shares open to everyone or large groups of people to ensure this access is provided. And tightening down this is challenging. This happens also in SharePoint Online. It happens also in across data stores. As you said, now there's 30 to 40 of them. There are a few approaches to this, like Microsoft's Azure Information Protection, which has classification and encryption. But what do you see as the best approach to handle this data management problem?
That's a big question. Now, right-sizing data access is a massive challenge. I think that first off, the easiest approach is eliminating access that is not being used. That's number one. And I've seen that deployed in many of the organizations that I used to work with. And it's not only cloud, it's also an approach that we've been taking for the past 20 years. That's actually my first startup, by the way. My first startup did identity and access management and entitlements management. We sold that company to CA back in 2014. And it's very close to data, right? Data and identity go together. You can't access data unless you're authenticated today. So first off, remove access that is not being used. Second, I think managers have the best context today inside the organization and the employee itself. So I believe that the future is going to go closer to what SailPoint used to do, which is kind of permission certification, which essentially says that employees will have to essentially explain why do they have specific access to that is very permissive, and then potentially their manager will need to reapprove that as well. I think that's the easiest approaches. So first off, eliminate access that is not being used, and highlight that because you can already understand the usage itself. Highlight to the employee that that he or she have access that is highly permissive, and then ask them, do you really need this? And lastly, of course, involve the managers and highlight the risks there. I think this gradual approach will be able to essentially minimize a lot of permissions to extremely sensitive information. And of course, combining that with compliance and regulation. Back in the day, in my first company, we essentially had to help organizations handle suburban auctioning. And then you had to kind of make sure that a teller in the bank cannot issue a loan, but also approves the loan, right? It's the same story here. You want to make sure that no one has access that they shouldn't have, and no one has toxic access as well.
Right.
I think that makes sense. So a follow-up question there. When you're talking about basically putting the onus on the user to say, I need this access, or this is why I need this access, and it goes to the data owner. That makes a lot of sense. It's very similar to what I've seen in the identity access and management security realm, especially around Active Directory and Azure AD, where users, the things that have worked well is have a system where basically someone has to request it and then re-request that access, basically revalidate the access to having privileged rights. So extending this to the data protection and security or data posture management side of things makes a lot of sense. When you're talking about this, certainly my thinking goes immediately to, okay, how do you ensure the data is classified appropriately in order for the user to know what they're applying for, and then certainly to ensure that the data that is classified a certain way gets managed or owned by the right folks? Because certainly you talked about unstructured data, structured data, and being across multiple data stores. It could be on-prem, it could be in Azure, it could be in AWS, it could be in GCP, multiple cloud providers. As you said, there's lots of different places where these can be. How do you pull all this together, and maybe what's the solution that you've taken, or the approach you've taken with Dig?
first off, I think this is why this challenge is so exciting, right? It's complicated. It's really complicated, and we're solving a really big problem for a lot of the organizations. Now, data classification is challenging. I think it became easier with technology. I think we learned from our past mistakes, right? In the past, data classification used to be regex-based. Regex-based does not really work in today's age. Everything looks the same. You don't want to take any combination of digits and say this is a credit card or a phone number. It doesn't really work. So first off, you need to have a very, very good data classification engine. In the DIG, we took the approach of a 4-tiered classification engine. So first off, of course, you need to be able to match a specific pattern. That's the same that we used to have in the past. Then, of course, you want to derive context. And deriving context is super important for this specific stage. So you always want to think about it as a funnel. How do we make sure that we have the right results? So context essentially can be brought in from multiple locations. If it's a file, you want to take the file name. You want to take the preceding words and the words after. You want to take the column name and the CSV if it's a CSV file. You want to take the key value if it's a JSON. You want to take the key value if it's an XML. So deriving context is super important from wherever you can, also in structured data. So you're taking the column name and the table name and understanding kind of everything that you can to essentially amplify or de-amplify the actual results. Third, you need to validate the actual results. So I think most modern data classification engines are now using validator functions. And validator functions can essentially validate that the result is actually correct. For credit cards, you have something called Lund's algorithm that essentially validates the checksum of the actual cards. And you can validate these structures with real functions that essentially validate the actual results. And lastly, we have models today. So whenever you have a noisy classifier, you can always incorporate a model to kind of fine-tune the actual results. And I think this 4-tiered approach is what the leading data classification engines today are doing, and it's the same approach that we essentially took as well. So first off, you need to have a really, really, really strong foundation for the actual data classification. You want to have the same classification across any type of data store and every type of cloud that you use, because otherwise, if you use different engines, it just becomes really, really complicated.
Inconsistency, yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's why, for example, the fact that Macy will only work on AWS and Purview will only work on Azure and Google Cloud DLP will only work on Google Cloud is just making it even harder, right? I actually think that the Google Cloud DLP engine is pretty good. It's just limited, right? Limited to specific types of data stores and specific clouds. And then once you have this good foundation of understanding which data you have, then you just need to apply it and use the same paradigm that we were talking about earlier. If the classification is correct, then users should be able to understand that they're accessing now credit card information or they're accessing restricted data. And then what surprised me, I think, in my last startup is that users, if you guide them correctly, will be your best help in cybersecurity. I think 90% is education, 10% is execution. So if you educate the users correctly and you prompt them correctly and you guide them throughout how do you help security make a better job, I think they'll help you always. You just need to make it easy for them. Because if it's hard, no one will do it.
Right. Very true. So we're running short on time, but we do have a few audience questions that I wanted to get into. And I'm going to try and combine two questions here. And I think you partially answered one of them about how you classify the data. So there's a question around, are those models customized to the customer? Or are they kind of generic across customers for different data types? And then the other question is more about, we talked a little bit about horizontal scaling. If somebody's got 15 different regions, they've got data residency concerns, but what if somebody's got like petabytes of data within like a single region? How do you scale vertically? And how much of a challenge is that when you get a customer that just has massive amounts of data, either in databases or just unstructured data sitting on S3 or Glacier or something like that?
Great questions. So first off, regarding classification, we essentially support today, I think, almost 150 different classifiers that we come with out of the box, but we also allow customers to build their own classifiers through the platform. And we've seen customers build that for membership cards and loyalty cards and gamer ID, because we work with a very large gaming company. We've seen that for specific routing numbers that are super sensitive to them. So most of our customers typically build a couple of classifiers that are specifically relevant for their businesses, but we come with our own and we constantly add additional ones. So that's regarding classification. Now, you mentioned earlier about scaling. So today we analyzed, I think, approximately 200 petabytes across our customer environments. And you mentioned vertically, but we actually scale horizontally. So how we typically work is that we analyze information using a set of spun up VMs that essentially do a classification job in a customer environment. So typically we spin up a VM to do a classification job. And once that classification job is dead, that VM essentially dies. Very typical to how Lambda works, but we need disk activity. So Lambdas are not the best thing. And that's basically how we scale. So each customer can define what's the maximum number of VMs that they allow the Dig security platform to run in their environment. And that's to essentially control cost. But from there, we have basically infinite scale. So customers can say, my environment is super large and I want to classify everything. And Dig will be able to run 20 VMs in parallel. And each one will essentially take a subset of the job. Or I want to limit the cost and make sure that only a maximum of 5 VMs can essentially run. And then, of course, we'll be able to cover a little bit less ground, but we'll cover everything just a little bit slower. So the ability to essentially control costs is through the maximum number of VMs, but the ability to scale is through that maximum number of VMs that we can essentially spin up to do scanning in that bucket or that database or that analytics data store.
Yeah. I think I was misusing the vertical and horizontal terms. I was kind of thinking in terms of number of regions and things like that. But yeah, absolutely makes sense that you can scale horizontally with the classification jobs. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I wish I could ask more questions around, kind of the customer process, the detection and response, and the kind of things that you see. We'll just have to have you come back and so we can fire some more questions at you, because I'm super interested. Yeah, once people get everything classified and they're comfortable using the product, I think there's a lot of interesting questions there around what that workflow looks like. What kind of insights and detections you can pull out of that. I imagine there's a whole niche of detection engineering just in a data security product like this.
Definitely. And we have a large data security research team. They actually presented today at B-Sites Tel Aviv. I was very proud. We found a very interesting vulnerability in Google Cloud, in their Cloud SQL, which is their managed SQL database. Right. So tons of detection engineering goes into the product. Super interesting work, and a really good team. But I'd love to come and chat about it again.
Yeah, now that we've covered the fundamentals, we can launch just straight into that next time.
Definitely.
All right, Dan, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today. This has been a really great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate the time.
All right, stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk IoT security with Paddy Harrington from Forrester Research. Attackers are only getting more proficient, so how can you proactively adapt your cybersecurity strategy? Core Security by Fortra helps you uncover and prioritize the risks that pose the biggest threat to your organization. Core Impact is a penetration testing tool that safely finds and exploits vulnerabilities using the same techniques as attackers. You can conduct advanced pen tests with ease using certified exploits and automations. Take your engagements even further by pairing with our additional red teaming tools from Cobalt Strike and Outflank. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Fortra Core Security. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Join us at an upcoming official cybersecurity summit in a city near you. The series of one-day, invitation-only, executive-level conferences are designed to educate senior cyber professionals on the latest threat landscape. We are pleased to offer our listeners $100 off admission when you use code SECWEEK23 to register. Visit securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit to learn more and register today. All right, and for our second interview today, Paddy Harrington joins us to talk about IoT security. Paddy is a senior analyst at Forrester Research, advising security and risk professionals. He focuses on endpoint security for everything from desktops to servers to IoT, which is what we're talking about today. Welcome to the show, Paddy.
Thanks, Adrian. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you back. We've had you on a few times before, had some good discussions. And IoT, I feel like I haven't been hearing enough about IoT lately. I think the last time we had somebody on to talk about IoT actually wasn't that long ago. We had, I think her name was Grace from IOXT Alliance, talking about building the security labels, that will actually presumably come on packaging and things like that. They're mostly focused on consumer stuff, but with IoT, it all bleeds together these days. It's there's a lot of stuff that you might think of as consumer, but you're still going to find in a lot of businesses and enterprises. So I guess maybe that brings me to my first question. The work that you're doing, this report you just had come out, the State of IoT Security report. What's the scope of it? What are you looking at?
So most of what we look at in this is on the business side of things. So we take the data from our surveys, which go to business leaders, either IT, telecom, or in the security side, and we try to understand what's affecting them for IoT. And the problem is that they just got shipped in last week to stuff that they've had in play years. So you've got this really broad range of devices on the network. And like you said, these are ranging from a smart TV or a projector to a check scanner, a rapid check scanner that's inside of a bank that has been in place for decades. And this is really a problem, I think, that the businesses are trying to get a hold of. The issue is this stuff is not stopping. We're not reducing the amount of IoT devices. We just keep adding in more and more devices, and it's just compounding the problems that already exist now.
Yeah, definitely. And, I love this kind of chat because I feel like we sometimes need a reality check. If you look at our news segments, the stuff we talk about, we talk about a lot of emerging technology. We talk about a lot of the latest, security markets and categories and things like that. And it's easy to forget that a lot of networks out there, I don't know what percentage, maybe most of them, are still pretty old school. There are still companies who manage their own data centers, who use the cloud minimally. Even folks who are maybe 100% cloud probably still have IoT devices, and things that are maybe unsupported, unsecured. I remember, last time I was really doing pen tests on a regular basis was maybe 5 years ago, and still finding, just tons of admin on, security cameras and all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, what's really bad is take that admin scenario that you talked about. These devices have this stuff hard coded in a lot of the older devices. And compounding to that is the information is publicly known. So there's websites that maintain these lists of the admin logins for all of these devices that are all over the place. And these go from, like I said, the simple stuff to heavy, we'll say, industrial machines. But then there's the other side of this where you get devices that are proprietary, so their firmware is proprietary. Okay, a little tougher to attack. But then you've got stuff that's built off Linux, and it's different kernel variants. So it was built, we'll say, 5 years ago, and hasn't really been updated since. So the amount of exploits in that Linux kernel just off the chart. Or some of the more scary ones are Windows-based IoT devices that are built running Windows 7, Windows XP, Windows 2000. There was one, yeah, right. And there was one I remember talking to not too long ago. Someone had it on their network running NT4.
Yeah, sure.
This is a honeypot waiting to happen.
Yeah, permanently, NT4 is permanently vulnerable to MS-08-067. Ask me how I know.
Little experience there, huh?
Yeah, definitely. It's back when I was a PCI QSA, I was also a pen tester at the same time. And in payment networks, you'd find all kinds of crazy stuff. That's why I mentioned Windows CE. There was a fast food restaurant chain, that I did, and all their POS devices were based on Windows CE back in 2012. So that's 11 years ago. Surely they've upgraded. Now we've kind of had this revolution in POS devices where like a lot of stuff is iPad based, like much better platforms than the janky glued together IoT devices we used to see in the past. But I imagine some folks out there are still using the old stuff.
Yeah, and especially when you get to the larger businesses, you look at say verticals like healthcare, finance, manufacturing, even they get these devices in place and they hum, they maintain. In banking,
20-year lifespan, 25-year lifespan.
The ATMs. How often do you see an ATM being ripped out and replaced? It's not often. So, the code that's running on there is just maintained. And there's been a lot of initiatives as of late, the last couple of years to drive these companies either through standards or government regulations, not a fan of, but another story, and trying to get them to maintain the firmware or OS for these devices on a longer timeline until the thing is truly dead. The hardware decides to kick out on it. Right. But that's only newer stuff. And these environments are running things that are ancient. Think of, watching a hospital bring in an MRI machine. This is an industrial IoT device. And how often is the firmware updated on that?
Yeah, so in the last conversation, we were talking about the difficulty of data discovery and classification. That's certainly one challenge, but we have it here in IoT as well. Back a couple years ago, I was doing product reviews, and for SE Magazine, you can actually still find these product reviews on semagazine.com if you go to research and then Security Weekly Labs. And one of those we were looking at where, I don't know, Paddy, if you study these products, if you follow the space as well, but your QRT, right? Qualys Rapid7 Tenables. If I were to scan my lab with those products, which I did, it's my lab is all built on Ubiquiti devices, which do run a form of Linux. They at its core it is Debian, but obviously highly customized to their use case, and it doesn't recognize them despite the MAC address, being registered by Ubiquiti. Ubiquiti has a custom service that they run that without authentication will tell you what the model number and serial number, the firmware version, anything you want to know about the device, it'll tell you. But a lot of these companies just haven't done the work of correctly cataloging all these IoT devices so that they can correctly identify them. So that seems like a huge gap in the market right now, is that there are so few products, and I think one of them is Run Zero, which used to be Rumble, is probably the best one I've seen at correctly identifying these devices. But if you don't even know they're there or what they are, much less if the firmware version is current, like how do people solve that problem without just like throwing a ton of manual work and people at it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of that are, let's say, the large-scale IoT management security platforms, right? And there's a dozen or so of them out there. Massive names that people know, like Clarity. Clarity came from the OT side, right? If you look at their name, there's OT right in the middle of it. And they've been expanding into the IoT world. Armis is another one that does a lot in this space. And they really take that, like I said, the MAC lookup, and they build that into their databases so that when they do either a passive or active scan, they can find the device, compare MACs, and figure out exactly what this is. But some of the interesting ones that are happening now are the edge devices, right? So different gateway manufacturers, firewall manufacturers are introducing IoT discovery solutions so that as this product is reaching out, it's an Internet of Things device, right? IoT. It picks up what the MAC is and understands, oh, let me do a MAC lookup and figure out who you are, what you are. And they start classifying these devices so you can at least now understand what's on the wire talking out. Now, it's not going to, find the stuff that has a bad gateway address, right? You can't truly identify, but at least gives you something of understanding what is talking through your edge so you can start identifying what's out there. And some of this stuff is fairly new, right? At least on the edge side. But then there's other solutions, like I say, that are starting to recognize, oh, we have to include sensors and scanners that can not only detect these devices, but do it safely. Because I'm sure you've seen this when you're doing pen testing. If you scan a device, some of these things, either IoT or OT devices, improperly, it blows up. Mm-hmm. In the IoT world, one of the common ones is if you do a vulnerability scan on a printer and it's not targeted for a printer, it just spits out junk, right?
Yeah. Jet Direct, what was it? TCP 9100. Yeah, it'll just print whatever data. It's the raw print port, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of the newer solutions, like I said, they're starting to do a safe scan so that they can recognize the IoT device without disturbing it, and then categorize it and catalog it so that you at least know what's there. And then, like I said, as the solution gets better, the more broad-based solutions can do lookups of that device and say, okay, I'm going to look this up to the manufacturer and compare firmware revisions or OS revisions. Are there known flaws, known vulnerabilities? And when you tie some of this stuff into the SOC tools, right? SIMs, SOARs, XDR solutions, you now get a complete picture of the devices on the wire and how vulnerable they are. So you can start addressing it. Is it going to solve all these problems and get everything? No, but it's a step in the right direction.
Right. Yeah, we see a lot of passive scanners and things like that. A lot of OT security products do that. But still, you shouldn't have to buy. I feel like you shouldn't have to buy 3, 4, 5 different products, just to do asset discovery and identification and vulnerability scanning for all your devites. So hopefully there's some consolidation there. And like we, there's now, Tenable.ot, Tenable Spot, an external attack surface management company. So we do see some of this consolidation happening, but it seems like it's going slowly. But
and it's sad to me because it took so long to do this. I mean, if you look at our reports over the last few years, right? We talked here, State of IoT 2023, but part of State of Endpoint 2022 that we did last year, we talked about targets. IoT was in the 33-34% range there. 2021, another IoT security report, State of IoT Security. It wasn't the top target, right? But it was a close number 2 behind the company website. So IoT devices have been a target for years. And, Forrester reporting on it for a while now. And now we're just getting to, we have to address these problems. Why weren't we doing this years ago?
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned the reports. Let's get into that. Tell us a little bit about this State of IoT Security report. I understand it's something that you do annually, but where does the data come from? What's the methodology for this report?
Yeah, so on the state of reports, state of IoT, state of endpoint, we use Forrester data, right? And this is collected through our various surveys that we do. And as I say, for these are business focused. So IoT leaders or IT leaders, telecom leaders, security, and trying to understand with the businesses, right, what they're seeing within their deployments. So, what I talked about there, right, of IoT being a target of attack, it's part of the security survey. So asking, okay, how many times were you attacked externally within the last year? And those numbers get really scary. Some of the reports that we do out of that, it's, the numbers keep growing and it's really bad. But okay, you were attacked, say, 3 times last year. And then the follow-up question is, what was the target of those attacks? And obviously we have the list of them. And like I said, these are Forrester data sets that we utilize this. So it's an analysis of this data and what we're seeing across the businesses. And it's when you start putting this all together and comparing this across the survey itself, right? So within the security survey or with the infrastructure survey, and see how the leaders think about securing, right, these IoT devices, you get some stuff that is eye-opening. For example, in the infrastructure and telecom survey, one of the things we found, and it's in the report, is security was towards the top of concerns for IT and telecom leaders, right? Mm-hmm. But security of IoT was a bit lower on the security leader side than other initiatives. And it's like, wait a second. You folks said the security survey, the IoT was your top target. Like I said, about 33%, all right, of the respondents said IoT was an attack target. Great. But security of these devices is lower than other priorities. But I have an issue with that. And especially that distraction from the telecom folks saying, no, security of IoT is pretty big on our list. So as you start going through this data and realizing it, you start scratching your head going, why aren't people more concerned? Why aren't they doing anything about this?
Well, so it's interesting. So what you're talking about there is they're concerned about it, but not doing anything about it. So I wonder if the issue is decisiveness, like they, or strategy, like they just don't know what to do about it, or haven't found a good approach to tackle it, or maybe they don't have the people to go after it. Like I was saying before, that this is just so, it's so difficult to just discover and identify these things, and not even talking about finding the asset owner, figuring out who owns this thing, who should be updating firmware on these things. Like maybe it's just too much for companies to tackle today.
Yeah, and we get a lot of that, and that feeds into these reports as well, of talking with customers, talking with some vendors and others to get the feedback of what everyone is seeing. Again, the customers directly through discussions we have, and then again, vendors giving what they see. So taking all this together, and a lot of it is, as you say, right? It's who owns these devices, and it's a bit of a mix. And sometimes it's a lot of finger pointing. Oh, you do, and
nobody
no one
wants to.
Exactly, right? The how do we tackle this is a big one. And as we just talked about, right, there's emerging solutions that are starting to pop up, but some of the old stuff was these massive IoT management systems. Well, you bring that in, it takes another team to manage that, especially you get to the larger enterprises. Well, these teams are stretched, to the breaking point already, and whether it's IT or security, the analysts in these teams are already working full days, going home, continuing to work, and now you want to tack on another technology to manage it and secure. Yeah. Burnout was bad enough as it is. You got to have people going, that's it, I'm done. I don't need this anymore. And I don't even want to talk about connected vehicle security. You want to really scare yourself good on that rat hole. Oh.
Right. And there's a whole, like, once you get into firmware, you're not just talking about IoT devices anymore. I mean, at least smartphones are fairly simple. Like either you've got an update available from a manufacturer or a telecom, or you don't. You can apply the update or not. But you get into laptops, the firmware on mobile devices like laptops, and there are computers and firmware embedded all over the place within a lot of these things, and a lot of companies, you might have half a dozen to a dozen PC vendors. You've got Macs, you've got just a mix of different devices here, different firmware levels. Like just looking at the work that companies like Eclipsium are doing here, it's not just IoT where we have this kind of firmware, this visibility of low level computing code on these devices and vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. We've got them within the laptop sitting right in front of everybody too, as a problem.
Yeah. And to compound to that, it's anywhere work, right? I take my device, I go home and I work in my network. Well, what are my IoT devices in my home network doing, and how are they impacted? And if someone compromises that, they now have a chance, if the attacker is skilled enough, to compromise my business laptop and then compromise Forrester. Oops.
Yeah.
So we've just taken the problems that have existed and extended it by everyone, the end user, address it in their home network. Home automation solutions or anything like that. And plus, I think of things in a security mindset. So I've got multiple networks and firewalls between everything. I'm just that bit of a nut about it, but most people don't, and I don't blame them. I'm not going to blame people for doing that, but it extends the problem, and especially if you keep maintaining things like VPNs. A VPN on a home PC, you've now taken that home network, which is possibly the most insecure thing running, and attached it to a business network. Way to go. So many issues.
Yeah, with your Netgear Nighthawk that hasn't been updated since the day it was purchased from Best Buy.
Exactly.
Yeah, so with these surveys, do you get any sense for how mature do people even have IoT security programs? Is it just folded into their vulnerability management program? Do you have any sense of the maturity level of people attacking this problem, or how they're thinking about this problem? Are they thinking about it separately, or is this just the redheaded stepchild kind of attached to vulnerability management?
Yeah, I mean, we do get some sense of that from the surveys, and it's part of the initiative side, right? As well as what are they planning on spending their budgets on, whether it's IT budgets or security budgets. So there's certainly a thought and a concern going on, with these leaders. The challenge is, take, for example, a somewhat related but different category. We talked earlier of mobile devices. Security leaders understand that mobile security is a concern. The implementation of it, though, any tools for this, State of Endpoint we talked about last year, the use of even basic mobile anti-malware, never mind mobile threat defense, below 50%. MTD was down in like the 30s or something to that effect. So there's concern, and they want to address it, but they don't. Other initiatives take hold. Something big pops right now, and they get redirected, and they spend the money on that, and then next year start all over again.
Right. So, what else from the report? Any other interesting insights that you pulled out of this?
I think a lot of this was things we talked about. One of them was on the patching side, as you talked about. These devices are incredibly old in some cases, or brand new. So having that patch management solution in place, it's a concern as you talk about, right, on the PC, the mobile server workloads and things like that. And they're now just starting to go, yeah, we do have to address that on IoT. How do we do it? right? And some of this also comes from the interviews and discussions that we do with our customers in various industries. You talk to someone in finance and they're dealing, like I mentioned, there's those rapid check scanners, right? Many decades ago, I worked as a teller at one point, and I remember having these big bulky scanning machines. They're dealing with devices like that, as well as brand new customer interaction IoT devices, or badge sensors that are wireless and can track the employee throughout the building or the complex to make sure that they're where they should be and not going to, where the vault is when they're not part of it. So some of this is understanding how do you effectively manage, patching and vulnerability scanning across these solutions. And like I said, it's a concern they have, and they're starting to spend time and money on it. But how fast can they get to it to address the attacks? And, we've talked before. You take a botnet like Mirai. Mirai has been running since 2016 through its various instances, right? And this is a denial of a service botnet, and it just keeps spinning over and changing. I think Fodcho was one of the offshoots of that ran last year. And then GiftGet, I think, was another. And both of them, they were peaking at, as DDoS attacks, going for like, a terabyte of throughput.
Yeah.
These things are crushing. So this is some of the stuff that we were trying to find out and understand with this, and address that or align that to what the business concerns were, so that they can understand, look, here's where the problems are. Here's what you've done so far. And I understand here's where your priorities are. Get on those priorities. Start hitting it now, because, this isn't slowing down. The attacks against these devices is just going to continue to grow. And this isn't just us saying this. If you look at various other folks in the industry, they're talking about this, and they're showing the raw data of what these attacks look like. And it's pretty bad.
And a lot of it's just product design. Like, you look at a lot of these IoT devices, and they're coming out of organizations that aren't software companies. They don't know how to design a modern device. So you might have a console like updating the firmware might require you to go to the company's website, sign into with your support account, download a binary, and then log into a web server on the device. Very much like a 90s, 2000s, early 2000s idea of architecture, of how to manage these devices. Whereas, like, if you look at any kind of modern, like a Nest device or any modern networking devices, everything's SaaS, right? And there's a console where you can manage multiple devices through a single console. You've got APIs, but I'm sure there's devices still out there where you've got to get an old laptop with an old web browser. You got to install Flash, and then you can log into the interface to upload that or I've seen IoT devices where you have to have where it's a Java applet you have to run to connect to the device and update the firmware. So I wonder how many of these companies like how do you manage that centrally when you've got to go get an old XP laptop and put an old version of the Java runtime on it just to update firmware?
Or even worse, where you have to go locally to the device. You've got to plug in, jack in through USB, and do all of your updates that way.
Or something like that.
Yeah. And it really becomes a challenge that makes all these things we've talked about even worse. And again, I don't want to make this all doom and gloom. When I talk IoT or connected vehicle, I tend to go down this, ever spiraling, doomscape. But there's a lot of changes going on. You talked about the IOXT, right, and what's happening there on the consumer side. And that's translating into business as well. As well as some of the manufacturers are recognizing, hey, if we have a little more space in the firmware side and add a few more resources for CPU and memory and such, we can get a small security agent on there. And maybe it won't be able to prevent attacks, but we can integrate this into our SIM or SOAR to understand what's going on and give us information off of the device so that we can now effectively track it, maintain, or understand potential vulnerabilities in the device, and at least give us some security posture of how this device is. And even if, like I said, we can't prevent on it, maybe we can move that prevention down to the network. So there are changes coming. It's just, as I said, you got to deal with the new as you bring in, and then keep maintaining that old stuff. And turning over an MRI machine, it sounds like a great idea, except of course it's a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment, so it doesn't happen too often.
So how much do you think legislation is going to have to move the needle here, where somebody just has to come in and say, look, you can't run that old stuff anymore? Like it's got to be something that's actively managed in terms of security patches.
Yeah, it's happening, and not only in the U.S., but it's happening globally. And there are some websites that pull together. I think it's IoT Trustmark is one of them, where they have like global security standards as well as recommendations, from government recommendations as well as government policy, right? The actual full-on regs, you have to comply with this. But they've got a great site which has all that compiled. I think there can be some benefit to it. To me, the challenge with regulation winds up being it's a race to the bottom of can we do just this much and pass the reg, right? So we don't have to do any more. And now that we've passed it this year, that's it. Next year, don't have to worry about it because, you backdate that regulation. You force people to spend millions, if not billions of dollars. And they, no, you can't do that. We'll go out of business. So they talk to congressmen and changes the reg and doesn't get anywhere. The standardization side, I think, is the more interesting one. And there's a push around on IoT standards. And I think that might have a bit more influence because it's hitting the device manufacturers to say, make your devices better. And it's hitting the software solution companies to say, make your vulnerability scanning better, make your network controls better, so that even if we can't remove this 10, 15-year-old device, we can put enough barriers around it at the various stages, from the network, from endpoint security sensors and vulnerability scanning, to at least protect it so that it doesn't get attacked, right? We can't change the device, but we can put the moats, if you will, mitigation around there. And and really control what gets in and out of that device better. And to be brutally honest, I think a lot of businesses, if they took that basic level of, dare I say the term, network access control, right? It's a bad word that, it had a great sounding name for a while and people didn't do much with it. But if you took those basic things of restricting what devices or people on your network can talk to that IoT device, as well as who they can talk to internally, as well as externally, you've overcome so many challenges that all these other things now become, we'll say, icing on top of it.
Yeah, zero trust initiatives should be doing exactly that, right? Should be, separating that stuff out, limiting the damage it could do if compromised, right?
Oh yeah. And it's this thing's happening, like I said, on the network edge, not only the identification, but some of the cool stuff I've been hearing about from some of the vendors is that they're doing traffic patterns. So this device is communicating with these external websites, right? And it's developing standards to look for normal traffic flow. And then if something goes off, it deviates from that standard, it pops alerts. Right. And this is kind of interesting because you can say, well, why did that device now start sending massive amounts of data? Did someone compromise the device? Is it just time of day, whatnot? Or the other side is traffic coming inbound to that device from maybe the manufacturer. So if there's now a massive influx of data to this device from the manufacturer, what changed? Was a firmware update pushed? Was the manufacturer compromised? We talk about problems, with the supply chain. Well, there's another attack vector. So,
yeah, you see companies like Netography. Like there's a new generation of network anomaly detection technology and stuff like that. So sure, yeah. So how many of these reports have you guys? How long have you been doing this annually? I think you said it was 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. So. State of reports can be an annual or semi-annual. release. So the last one that was done, I came to Forrester last year. Before me, the team did it in 2021. So every other year, I included IoT devices as part of State of Endpoint Security last year when I worked on that report with the team, because, my coverage is endpoint, and as you said in the intro, right, it's a wide range of things. So I wanted to make sure that was addressed last year. But will I do, or will we do IoT, State of IoT Security next year? Not sure. We'll see how the data flows. Right? Is it that different from this year?
Well, that's kind of the reason I ask. Yeah. So that's the question is, are you seeing any positive developments here? Are you seeing any signs of hope that things are getting better? Or I guess you're kind of already answering the question. You're like, maybe it's not even worth doing another State of IoT report next year.
Yeah, and we'll have to see what the data comes back with, right? We get the surveys out through various times of the year, depending on what the survey is. So as the data comes back, that gives us analysts some understanding of, all right, next year, right, 2024. It's really scary saying that term. What does this look like? And if it's not that much of a variance between years, okay, maybe it's not worth doing it. But who knows, right? And there's other reports that kind of tie to this stuff. So, we talk about endpoint security, right? Doing that last year, State of Endpoint Security. Well, that led to a landscape that we did at the end of the year on endpoint security, and it's leading to a wave on endpoint security that's kicked off this year. So we tend to compound these reports, right? So take the data from one, analyze it, understand, do we need to dive deeper? Do we need to do these landscapes talking about the various vendors in this space and then do a comparative analysis? Or here's this information, stew on it, and then maybe next year we'll get to another stuff. So like I said, they do tend to build off of each other.
All right. Good stuff. Paddy, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Thank you, Adrian. Appreciate it.
All right. We'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly Enterprise News.
Created in 2005 and hosted by security industry veterans, Paul's Security Weekly is your source for in-depth coverage of the latest vulnerabilities, exploits, and security research. Our weekly security news discussion dives deep into the security issues we face today and potential solutions in a fun and lively atmosphere. Each week, we bring on guests from the security community to learn about their journey and discuss topics relevant to their work and research. You can also subscribe to our show by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Paul's Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher. We've recorded a ton of content over the years, so we created Spotify playlists featuring some of our favorite episodes, including interviews with Marcus Random, John McAfee, and Chris Roberts, to name a few. You can find them at securityweekly.com/starter packs.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates across our organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. And now for the Enterprise Security Weekly news. You can check out securityweekly.com/ESW322 if you want to follow along as we go through the news, or for links to any of the articles that we are going to be talking about. So in the intro here, I had all the numbers. It's pretty interesting. There's not been a whole lot of funding. In fact, the Sierra funding, this $100 million Series B, is something of an anomaly. Like there was I don't think I got it in here, but there was a TechCrunch article basically saying like the 9-digit funding rounds are just going to be gone. Like we're not going to see those anymore. So the fact that we're seeing one of those is interesting. And this $100 million round is bigger than the last 2 weeks of all fundings across 13 different startups. So it's definitely an anomaly, I think.
Well, do you think there's still money out there? It's just a matter of folks being a little nervous about where to position it or place it, or do you think that the companies that are looking for funding right now just aren't as compelling? What do you think? What do you think's going on?
I don't know. I mean, we've certainly. So if you look at the security funded newsletter, one of the things that he does is every week he graphs out this year compared to last year, and we've had some months where it was actually the funding was a bit higher than last year, but it's very inconsistent. So it could be just the time of year. This isn't a time that people are going to finish raising funds or announcing those funds, this time between RSA and Black Hat. Maybe people want to make those announcements closer to Black Hat or something like that. So it could be as simple as timing. But yeah, it'll be interesting to, I've often said cybersecurity is different from other categories of startups, tend to be a little bit more resilient. And, we'll see how much that translates. I mean, we're certainly still seeing layoffs from cybersecurity vendors and tech vendors in general. Like those haven't stopped. We've stopped including them in the updates just because they've become so common. They're not even being covered by journalists anymore. So it's actually kind of hard to find them. You would have to actually go to LinkedIn, and if you pay for LinkedIn Pro, you can actually see the trend line for employees for a company. That's sometimes the only way I can tell that layoffs have occurred at some of these companies.
Yeah.
Looked like you wanted to say something, Katie.
So I know a lot of people say that, security is more resilient thing and have been for years. And in some regards, that's true. But I definitely see a truing up of the industry. And, anecdotally through personal networks, I hear layoffs every day in, the security industry, as I'm sure you all do and many of our listeners do as well. So I'm not sure it's a good thing to position security as this, somewhat economy world view resilient industry, because I think it's definitely, there's a little bit of a reckoning coming, and I still see online, especially on my security social media networks, that people in security have kind of an attitude about who should, quote unquote, be in security. I saw a post this morning from somebody who's been in security for years, basically saying, if you don't have any tech skill, you don't belong in security. And that's not doing us any favors. And it's definitely not doing companies any favors if they're trying to position themselves as a good company to work for. And we all know that there's a security crunch in terms of talent. So having those people publicly posting stuff while the economy is sort of in a bad place, and VC funding, I mean, there was also an article on LinkedIn about how private equity is essentially drying up. So this is not something that we're going to skate by, I don't think. I mean, if you guys have a difference of opinion, I'd love to hear it, but I don't think we're going to skate through this one.
Yeah, I mean, that just leads to failures. Like I would, if that's the trend, if PE has dried up, or even if it slows down, even if PE deals continue but slow down, there going to be some companies not getting exits in Q4, Q1, Q2 next year. It all depends on how much they were able to manage burn and slow down, and the companies that did layoffs, like those are the ones that are more likely to survive because they've curbed that burn so much. They've stretched their runway out. But yeah, and we've seen some failures already. We've seen some companies close up shop, which is pretty rare for to see that happen without at least some kind of a bad deal, an exit, but not a good exit for investors, but something that allows some employees to keep their jobs and the product to continue running for customers. So yeah, I'm wondering when we're gonna, if we're gonna see that ramp up. If we're gonna have a new category in the news here where, it's just deaths, just company deaths.
Do you think we're going to see a difference in by series, or do you think this is just across all of them, like Series A, B, whatever?
I would expect to see it in the later series. The ones that have more to lose, that have the higher burn, that are larger, and maybe grew, where their revenue, their ARR did not grow along with their, them adding employees and the things that increase that burn. So yeah, I would expect to see the later stage. I would expect to see more failures there. So maybe even public companies that went public in the last couple of years. Like we do have a story about IronNet here, where somebody's offering to save them, but only if they get rid of the one of the founders and CEO. But yeah, last year, if we look at last year, the security unicorns stopped almost in the same month that we saw layoffs start. So we did have that happen in the news, where we had never had a category for layoffs before, and all of a sudden that started dominating our news conversations. And we had a graphic for unicorns that we haven't really had a need for in the last year. Like we used to have, I think it was an average of like 2 or 3 new security unicorns every month to talk about, and that poor graphic doesn't get much use anymore because those just stopped, and that all happened in the same, really over 2-month period last May and June. So that's exactly a year ago now that we saw that switch happen, almost in like a 6-week period. So when this does happen, we could see it happen that quickly, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know how accurate they are, but at least some of the market reports I've read on the finance side say we're looking at another year of this, at least. Yeah. And I do think security lived through some era of heyday, and this is just, again, I'll use the same word, truing up of the market. And I don't think a lot of security people saw this coming. That doesn't mean security is going to go away. I mean, so I certainly don't I hope no one listening to this thinks I think that. But we've got so many vendor companies, just so many vendor companies. And do we really need them all? Probably not. I don't want to go to, a monopoly model either, right? Because that's bad for the market. It's bad for progress, bad for innovation, bad for so many things. But do we need 15 to 20 companies or more in every space? I don't know. Like, will this just suss out the companies that are creating a product to create a product, or creating a product to go IPO, which isn't happening, or creating a product to get acquired? We've seen, and again, these aren't necessarily publicly reported, but a lot of acqui-hires in the last year. And I think probably more than we've seen over the past 5 years to decade. And this is just companies getting out to cut their losses because they're not going to make, they're not going to be those duo security type exits.
Right.
Right. And as a person kind of on the outside looking in, you two both have much more inside industry knowledge and experience than I do, certainly around funding and startups and things like that. From my perspective, really, I see it as something that is, this is kind of indicative of what we've been seeing as far as growth being more stagnant. I mean, last year we saw the layoffs start to really cycle through from the larger companies and then smaller companies. All the companies have been talking about how growth has slowed down from what it was, which of course it makes sense that it would have. 2021 being kind of a banner year for a lot of industries. And then into 2022, as we hit inflation and other things, people started tightening up their belts. So that consumer growth went down. People stopped spending money like they did. Money wasn't as available or as cheap, I should say. And so then budgets started tightening up a little bit. People were holding on to the money they had because now it potentially is more valuable, or at least cash might be more valuable because borrowing money is more difficult. As you said, Katie, the private equity money is not there like it was. So do you feel like what we're seeing is really kind of the situation where these startups are not seeing as much money going into them, as well as the fact that many of them are just failing because there just isn't as much money to go around as there was before, and there isn't as much growth to support and kind of prop up all these things. So I don't necessarily see it as a failure of the security industry, or the security industry is any less valuable, so to speak, as just the bubble burst kind of, it was unsustainable in that level of growth, and security can't always be the thing that everyone can fund all the time. There has to be some limits around it. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
I think that's very accurate. I think, we're seeing sales slow down quite a bit. Buyers, consumers of security products, they're not stopping necessarily. It's just taking a lot longer because there's a lot more scrutiny throughout the sales process. There needs to be more justification because we did have this situation where security teams were given very large budgets and being told, just do whatever you can to keep us secure, keep us out of the news. That is not the case now.
Yeah, I've been talking to a lot of enterprises that are really cleaning house and making sure they don't have any products that are on the shelf or, not pulling their weight or, don't have value. And, I'm faculty over at IANS. And so a lot of these advisory calls that I have are companies that have questions as they're going through this process of trying to figure out, okay, who's getting cut, who's sticking around, and maybe, just maybe, we might buy something new here. But for the most part, it's reevaluating everything in their budget, in their current budget, and trying to decide if it's worth keeping there or not.
And of course, that hits ARR numbers, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I can tell you just, from my company, we have 2 products coming under one platform, and one of them has a cost optimization. It's a SaaS management product, and it has a cost optimization component to it, looking at licensing, and also part of the SaaS management for asset management is where are users touching various products, maybe unmanaged, maybe shadow SaaS, all that. And that question is being asked way more, not just in SaaS management, SaaS app management, but in our CAM side too. Like, hey, when are you going to help us with this stuff too? Like, where do we have redundancies? Where are we spending too much? Is there anything in our environment that we could consolidate? What type of product categories can overlap sufficiently enough that we can end this, service agreement with X company or some, things like that. I'm hearing that through our sales teams a lot more in the past quarter than I did in the past year and a half that I've been there.
I've heard the same thing. I was visiting a customer yesterday, and there was a conversation specifically around optimizing cloud spend and figuring out what are the subscriptions they have. Does it make sense? How to optimize that? How to cut on costs? I was visiting a customer just last month, and they were talking very similarly. They were talking about looking at these big contracts, these big vendor and products that they're using, and really how to better optimize those or just cut them out entirely. And these were big names they were looking at, and I'm like, wow, that's impressive. And both these companies are Fortune 100 companies, so not companies that you would be like, oh, well, they've got to cut necessarily. They have money, they've been making revenue year over year and profit year over year. But yeah, I think it's a little bit of a belt tightening. I think it's more of what you said was, they have been able to spend, and now it's like, okay, well, let's be more careful. Let's be a little more diligent. Let's really look at what we're spending money on and ensure that we know that this makes sense, and we can tie that to a key benefit here. And so, yeah, it makes sense to clear house and some of the tools and optimize around spend, especially for licenses. And I think we're going to continue seeing that in the next year, which certainly affects startups. Promoting a product is hard. I think we all know that. Getting a new product on the market when you have no name is very difficult, especially with some of the names we've seen. But like it's a challenge. We're redacted.
Yeah. Redacted is gone. Yeah, they're
redacted has been redacted.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. I enjoyed hanging out with some of the redacted folks last year at Black Hat. So I'm sure I'll see them again somewhere else, maybe unredacted.
Unredacted, yeah. So the positives coming out of this is the companies that survive are going to be the ones that can really justify spend on their product, can show some ROI. To your point, Katie, even having a product that literally shows you how much money it can save you is going to be interesting here. And yeah, across SaaS, there's a ton of spend across SaaS. And it's what our product does also at Valence is, we'll tell you, just all the accounts and the resources that nobody's using. Nobody's touched it in 3 months and 6 months and a year. Why are you still paying for it? So it's, be interesting to see the companies that come out stronger through this period.
Well, maybe I'll start a company that just leverages AI to optimize spend on licenses, and then I can just dominate the market across everything.
I'd be surprised if that's not already happening somewhere.
Maybe I'm sure it is.
Next month. And speaking of using AI, this Sierra press release, it's just all over it. They say, so there's going to be some quotes coming out of the press release here. Sierra's AI-powered data security platform instantly learns an enterprise's unique data and its business purpose. Bad news, Dan Benjamin. This is, I think at the beginning of this, they call themselves the data security company. Hubris is basically required for PR, for press releases, but it doesn't make me cringe any less at it. This is also a DSPM company, though they kind of list it as a feature, not as their category. But yeah, they're saying they use large language models to automatically discover, classify, and secure sensitive data everywhere. That's a lot. It's impressive if they're doing that stuff. Say they're doing some natural language processing also. So sure, for unstructured data, I guess I could see how you'd use an LLM for that. Certainly I had to do a data cleanup project. I basically had this data I scraped off a website and it was poorly formatted. And I wanted to get it into like a CSV format, to load into a database or a spreadsheet or wherever I wanted to put it. And ChatGPT did a beautiful job of it. The only issue I had is there's a limit to how much data you can give it per prompt. So I had to chunk up the data and automate it. But did a perfect job. Didn't put a single comma in the wrong place when cleaning up that data. So yeah, I can see how they're using LLMs to do this. The next one, Venn, I think I've finally cracked this. I finally understood. I think they're confused about what an MDM is. I don't think an MDM is what they think it is. Because they're comparing.
So who's confused, Venn or the press release writer?
Well, looking at their website, maybe the press release writer. So that's a good. No, the copy in the website is also confused.
Also completely confused. Oh yeah.
So what they're doing is I can understand some of the confusion. We actually saw some mobile MDMs, that branded themselves as MDMs that did something similar. There was a company that Google bought a while back where it was an Android app where you could flip in between two modes. Like you had a work enclave, kind of like Samsung has their, what's it called? They have their own product that they do this with, and I'm just blanking on the name. Maybe somebody in the audience will come up with it. But it's the idea of having these two separate enclaves, your personal data, your work data. And from the work side, you can just snap your fingers, push a button, and delete that work enclave.
Is that Knox?
Yeah, Knox. Yeah, Samsung Knox. So that's kind of what they're pitching here is something that's kind of like a Samsung Knox. But when somebody says MDM, I think about device management. I don't think about how work is being accessed and saved to the device and things like that. So they're comparing their solution to VDI. I have no idea how they're implementing this, but yeah, segmentation of workloads, like having like a micro segment or what did Bromium call it? Micro virtualization, and then you've got cubes, which literally runs different workloads in different areas, and the color of the border around your window and the UI tells you what enclave that it's in. So if it's a red border, different windows with a red border, you can copy and paste data in between, but you can't copy and paste data from a red window into a blue window or something like that. So literally, think of it in terms of, creating VPCs or DMZs between applications on the device, which is very different from, enforced patching,
right.
Setting Windows settings or Mac settings, when I hear MDM, I'm thinking Microsoft Intune. I'm thinking
that's
Jeff.
What I thought as well. Yeah.
Exactly. Very, very confusing language and use of acronyms here that I think they could clean up a bit. So now I understand what they're doing, but the press release is very confusing. All right, and they raised some money. $29 million Series A so that's one thing we've seen is when there are raises, like they're normal size raises. Asterisk says they raised $25 million. I assume that's a Series A. This $100 million Series B. So like the size of these raises doesn't seem to have been impacted. It's just the number of fundings we've been seeing is just way down.
Does this Venn seem to anybody else like a next-gen Citrix?
Like I said, I don't know how. I don't see how the technology works. I don't think there's any kind of remote component to it that I can see here. Requires zero back-end infrastructure. So they're doing this all on the device. So it's not like a Citrix, it's not like VDI, it's not like a remote browser.
Which is your favorite topic?
Oh yeah, that and enterprise browsers. Yeah. Well, and that's also confusing, right? Like the idea of your browser session living on a server in the cloud is very different from what Island and Talent are doing. Yeah, I mean, it just sounds like Bromium all over again here. Application isolation, stuff like that. I don't know that the market is asking for this. Sandboxing between apps, basically.
It seems like, again, we have enough categories that we don't need to create another weird hybrid category.
I mean, I think it's definitely an easier sell not having a remote component to it. The fact that everything's local, so, your app isn't going to, your work app isn't going to suddenly stop working if you have crappy hotel Wi-Fi, right? So that's a plus. But and again, I think there is a use for enterprise browsers and for what Venn is selling here, but I think it's niche. It's not something you buy for every employee in your company. It's something that you're going to get and put on a laptop for a contractor to be able to safely work on stuff from their own equipment. For you to have that compromise of trusting, an untrusted non-employee with working with your data, handling your data. That's the niche I see this being used in. I don't know how big that market is, but it certainly exists.
Yeah, while you were talking, I read a little bit more into the website, and I'm probably more confused than I was before. It says the Venn technology embraces a cloud environment to more efficiently combine a local personal computer experience with cloud data, all while wrapping data and sensitive information in a secure perimeter. I don't know. Maybe there's a cloud VDI involved. I don't know.
Yeah, that's. I think they have a copy. It's just confusing copy, but I don't know. It does seem like another Bromium, which Bromium still exists at HP. Like that technology is still out there. They were a sponsor last year, I think, and we did have we chatted with them about it, but it's totally clear from that conversation that we had that it is kind of a niche thing. Like every employee is not going to get this.
Where is this company based out of? Because they have some editing issues on their websites.
Yeah, I can't space. I don't know. Here it is. New York, it says. New York City.
Oh.
Anyway, we should move on.
We should move on.
So we got a couple acquisitions here. Bales proposes to acquire Tesserent, which I wasn't familiar with, but apparently it's one of the largest MSSPs in New Zealand and Australia. And honestly, there's like 6 or 7 of these deals every week. I don't pull them into the news because they're so common. The main reason I did in this case is because it was a company that I had heard of, and it was a pretty large looking deal. No details on how large the deal is, but I would expect it to be larger than a lot of the $5 to $50 million MSSP acquisitions that we see all over the world every week.
Yeah, I read that as Tesseract, so I was very confused initially. It's my Marvel brain kicking in.
And then HashiCorp picked up Blue Bracket. Makes a lot of sense. Secret scanning. I consider secret scanning to be kind of part of the external attack surface management market. Basically looking for anything that can, that can hurt you in terms of, an attacker being able to scan for it and take advantage of it. But even if it's not exposed to the outside, say this is like a private GitHub or private Atlassian Bitbucket or something like that, you want to know if you've got hard-coded or plain text credentials or API keys or anything like that just sitting in your code, because accounts do get compromised, and attackers that's the first thing they're going to look for. They're going to look for credentials that give them access to other things. That's what we see happen in so many of these breaches. So I'm not sure I'd even heard of Blue Bracket. Maybe we had talked about them before, but similar to GitGuardian, what they do. They're just looking for creds and code. Creds and code. So we talked about the IronNet deal. Got a few new companies here. My friend Nipun Gupta is working, has a company called Bear Cloud. I don't know a ton about it, but it looks like they're doing AppSec. Looks like custom built SAST engine. What else do we have here? Codem Security, I think, is also AppSec. Yeah, this is SCA, vulnerability management, ASPM. It's another term that we've got to get used to seeing. Application security posture management. Then Silent Push Threat Intelligence. I think this was a French company. All right, and then we get into cyber insurance. Katie, do you want to talk about cyber insurance for a little bit?
Sure, we can talk about cyber insurance for a little bit. It's just that, we've had a lot of people way smarter than me who have been on this podcast talking about cyber insurance and how it's changing. From an end user point of view, though, it's still incredibly confusing, and a lot of the people I talk to who are either at companies who are evaluating or using or trying to figure out the market, they're still just kind of in this phase where they don't quite get it. And that's not because they're not knowledgeable about things or not smart and can't learn about things. It's because the market for cyber insurance is even more complicated than other types of insurance we're used to dealing with. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I've a few times in my career been asked to look at health insurance. And that's overwhelming. And I've had health insurance my whole life, and health insurance has been around for, way longer than I've been alive. And cyber insurance has not been around for that long comparatively. And it keeps changing. So when end users are looking into the market, what's that?
It's because it's new, right? Like they're trying to figure out how to make it work.
Well, it's not only that it's new. That is a big part of it, but it's that from company to company, from insurer to insurer, there are different requirements. And then cybersecurity in general is changing and evolving so much. And if you look at the regulatory landscape, which is something I'm also going to be writing on pretty soon, we've seen this like hockey stick growth in regulations over the past few years. And that's in response to the market. And everybody's trying to get their hands around it and control it and be like, we have all the things, we know all of the things, and we have to secure all of the things, and we have to do all of the things. Well, that's great. But I just completed a controls checklist for one of the more popular industry frameworks. That was 1,065 different controls. I'm not exaggerating. 1,065 controls. How do I know this specifically? Because I filled all those rows out in an Excel spreadsheet and then compared two regulations. So that's 1,065 times 6. There were 6 different columns. Now you're a company who has to figure out how to make your security program fit into all of those controls. And it's overwhelming to look at 1,065 columns and go, okay, these are the things I need to do. But let's take one area. Let's take encryption. You don't just do one thing for encryption and you're done. You have to do it different places, and there are different use cases, and it's just so complicated that the insurance market is trying to follow all these trends. They're trying to say, all right, we have all these things that need to be covered. There are all these things you need to do, company X. And companies are going, I don't know what to do. And then the requirements from insurance and requirements from legislation. And it's really overwhelming. And it's not that insurance is inherently bad or evil, but their goal is not to lose money. Their goal isn't to necessarily CYA, my friends. I'm sorry. It's not. It's to make money for themselves. And so the requirements are stricter because they're trying to insure themselves against insurance payouts.
Insure themselves. So the other story we have here is saying it does seem to be working. You know, they say loss ratio fell considerably, 23 to 43% on standalone policies. Not sure how many companies have standalones, maybe smaller businesses. And then 18% to 48% on package policies. And in general, the market increased by 50% in 2022. So, it looks like they're finding some profitability. I think we saw some insurers just drop out, but it seems like the ones that are sticking around are finding something that works.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. I mean, Trimark, we ended up working with one cybersecurity insurance company in 2021, 2022, and after 2020, where even into 2021, where a lot of cybersecurity insurance policies, cyber liability policies made nothing, like they had no profit because of ransomware, because of the attacks. They really restricted and restructured how they were writing those policies. We did a significant amount of work working with underwriters to really understand what they're looking for and help better explain from an identity access and management around Active Directory and Azure AD what companies typically have and how to better qualify risk to include certain elements of helping with policies and things like that. It's a challenge because when you are identifying if you're insuring a car, you're insuring a house, and it's in a certain area, you have time that you can look at, to Katie's point. You can look at the certain elements of risk, whereas cybersecurity, cyber insurance, it's very difficult because it is very difficult to qualify the cybersecurity level of capability of one company versus another, and how to better quantify that risk is a challenge as well. I mean, certainly Forbes has tried to do it. Adrian had posted about that a couple weeks ago. But from what I've seen, a lot of the environments have these challenges. And I think the other side of this is, sure, this is insurance against a breach, against an attack. And in that scenario, the insurance is there to help get out of that, working with incident response, et cetera. But I think one of the big problems that we have as an industry today is that a company gets breached, they go through the process to clean up what happened, evict the attacker, and then work through a scenario where they are fixing the things that were the things that got them there, and then they move on. At some point, it's life as usual, business as like there are issues around. I feel like there's issues around the situation where there's post-breach hardening that is not there yet. We really need to get better about that. We need to do better proactive hardening against breaches, and we need to do a better job once an organization is breached, that there are things that are done after the fact in order to tighten things up. This is something I'm pretty passionate about. As you can see, I'm actually thinking about doing a webcast about it because I think this is important.
Yeah, speaking of which, 17 and 18 are about how breaches are handled, breach announcements and notifying shareholders of breaches. So both those stories are about the SEC, about new and proposed rules. And the number 18, Who's Afraid of the SEC article, is like, none of this is brand new. We've talked about this before in the podcast, but this particular write-up from dfrlab.org is a really good roundup and discussion of kind of the pros and cons of these different rules, what they include, what they don't include. The big thing I've been hoping to see in some of this legislation is some way for us to get details about, so we can do failure analysis, so we can figure out how the attack happened. Like it's not useful to know how the attacker got the initial foothold and then nothing else, or to know that it was an extortion case or something like that. There's a lot of nuances in there that are super important lessons for companies to learn from, so that it doesn't happen to them, that we just don't get out of these post-breach investigations. And the 8K isn't going to have all those details in it. Sometimes it takes months, to fully complete the investigation to put that together. But I feel like the industry needs those details. I don't even care if it's anonymous. And this is kind of, might have heard this rant from me before, but yeah, we just need to know the failure modes and the details behind how those failures occurred so we can improve. I don't care who the company is. Like, maybe it's important to know what vertical they're from.
Right.
But, if it embarrasses the company, fine, make it anonymous, but tell us what happened so we can learn from their mistakes.
Yeah, and I think our industry tends to be very malware heavy when it comes to post-breach analysis. Like, what was the malware? What did the malware do? How did it do it? What was the executable? What was the DLL? How did it avoid or minimize EDR type alerts? Who cares? Like, from my perspective, I don't care about that. What do they do after that? How do they actually jump from that computer to then get admin rights on a system to then go and do other stuff? And what are the things that a company could do to better identify that and mitigate it? I think that's the part that we keep missing as an industry.
Yeah, I think that's largely because to a lot of people who got into security, years ago, that was how they got into it, by looking for cool things, or at least cool things to them, on the internet. And when they could find it, and analyzing malware is a whole heck of a lot more interesting than being like, well, my access is totally overprivileged here. That's boring. Let's check what AD group they're in. Like, that's not nearly as fun as looking at what malware did. Let's just be honest. But if you look at all these mega breaches, it's this basic security stuff that every breach comes down to. And I'm kind of stealing that from an old colleague, Rafe Moise, who used to speak at InfoSec World. I don't know if he does anymore, but he wrote books on it and analyzing all the mega breaches. It's the non-sexy stuff that causes the breaches, but it's way more fun to look at malware and how it did something.
Yeah, I like to say malware is just the beginning.
An element of immaturity in our industry, maybe, but every other industry that deals with safety has some kind of public reporting process, some kind of incident report that you can go look at and you can understand. And it's more than just the DFIR details, right? Like, it's, what was the management structure? What was the company culture like? Like when we do get those details from breaches, we learn as much, if not more, from how security was handled at the company than from the individual details of how the attacker got from point A to point B to point C.
Now, I can say that a lot of the breach reports that I've seen have to do directly with service accounts that are highly privileged, old passwords that are guessable. Those are the things that tend to lead to the majority of the breaches out there. So if you're listening and you have an IAM system, identity system, look at the service accounts and try to reduce their rights. That is one of the things that you can really do to improve security against a breach.
There's no MFA for those service accounts.
There's nothing for those service accounts, and they tend to be all over the place. I mean, just see SolarWinds.
Yeah. So speaking of best practices and stuff like that, the EU put out a good practices for supply chain cybersecurity document, and I'm a little tickled that they called them good practices and not best practices. Kudos to them for dodging that bullet.
And I like that you wrote goodest even.
Yeah. Gooder practices.
21 is a really so Tines is super interesting. So Tines is a SOAR platform. And they're not the only one built this way, but they're very visible, very transparent. They have this library where you can go see what people are building with Tines. So you can build an automation on Tines, and you can share that on their platform. And that's basically what this Twitter is just like a list of all the crazy automations that people have worked out with Tines. And kind of the cool thing about it that I think is leading to so many people using it beyond just the transparency, them sharing these automations and these use cases, because that's the toughest thing. Like, give somebody an automation platform, and imagination is the toughest thing for them to come up with, to figure out, how can I reduce manual work with this? How can I be clever and outsmart an attacker with some kind of automation? And the thing I love about it is when you need to integrate with something, all it needs to have is an API. And you don't have to know how to write code to use that API. You do need to understand the API endpoints and, how to put together that REST API request and all that. But you do it all with a graphical interface. And unlike other SOAR tools, there's no need to build a connector. So that's often the amount of work it takes to build a connector. Same thing with a SIM. If you have to build a parser, like, that's usually the point where somebody's like, yeah, it's not worth the work. Not going to do that. Right. Same thing with the old school SOARs. Like it's now Palo Alto XSOAR, and I forget what Phantom got renamed to over at Splunk. But yeah, that point where you have to build and maintain a connector, which is basically a piece of code that parses out all the API requests and things like that. That's the point where somebody's like, yeah, it's just not worth the work. And I think that's where Tines has kind of figured this out and removed that friction. And it's really, you don't even need an account. You can just click some of these and you can see the entire graphical workflow of how that automation works, the decision tree, all that. And it's fun to geek out on. And I think it's going to do a lot of good for the industry.
That's really good to hear, because oftentimes I hear customizability and configuration, the ability to configure whatever you want. I hear complexity with that. You can do whatever you want with it. Okay, what can I do? How do I do that? Okay, well, you go ahead and do it. So I'm glad to hear that Tines is basically like, you can do a whole bunch of stuff, but here are some things that we've already built in it for you, and then there's also some graphical ways of doing this to make it easy.
And with the Fortune 100, we have an API is maybe good news for them. Maybe they have extra Python developers sitting on their hands, but for everybody else, that's a huge red flag. That's we have an API. You can do whatever you want with your product. Well, no, we can't, because we don't have unlimited, programmers to just kind of throw at this and overhead to throw at this problem. That's why we're paying you. Right?
Exactly.
Next one here, 22, friend of the show, Guillaume Ross, and occasional co-host, did a write-up on DSPM tools, which is something we've been talking about a lot today on this episode. And it's an interesting write-up, worth a look. Always good to see somebody else's perspective on what a DSPM tool is, where it fits in, how it works. What else do we have here? So I noticed a project that I've been working on over the last 7-8 years has been making the rounds through all the newsletters. So I thought I might as well put it on here as well. So my Destroyed by Breach research, which is a list of all the companies that have been directly destroyed by a cyber incident, has been making the rounds through. Started with Clint Gibler's TLDR-Sec newsletter, made it through Daniel Miesler's, and then I saw it on Mike Privet's security-funded newsletter. So I thought I might throw it on here as well. But if anybody knows of any companies I'm missing on that list, get in touch, let me know. And we're up to 24. We just saw a hospital that claimed they went out of business. Primarily because of a ransomware event that they went through. That kind of just started a snowball effect where they couldn't get paid for a long period of time, and finances just never recovered after that. We've got a few hot takes here. First one is more of like an IT hot take, but definitely has a security component, number 26. This is they used to be 37 Signals. They renamed themselves to Basecamp. They also run the Hey email service, of which I'm a user of that. Been a user of that since it came out. And it's just, I like it because they're very transparent about how much they've been spending on AWS and how much they stand to save by running things themselves. And it's always interesting to see somebody who's a contrarian, to the trends, and says, actually, and to be fair, I don't think, maybe in the early days, public cloud was pitching as having some kind of cost savings to it. I think it became clear to everybody really early on that it was really the flexibility, that should be your main driver for using cloud. Your ability to completely revamp your data center from day one to day two, just overnight, and I don't think I've seen many cases where anybody was claiming they were saving a ton of money by going to the cloud. So
I think that was one of the early promises, but that sort of went out the window very quickly in like 2010.
So a bit of a straw man argument here because I think the convenience and the ability to scale extremely quickly, or reconfigure or even just reboot your entire cloud. Like we've seen people who have DRBCP scenarios where they can basically run a Terraform, a series of scripts and just reload everything. Like they could lose their entire cloud and just build it all back again as long as their data is safe somewhere.
Yeah, the article definitely highlights that, saying that the main difference is a lag time between needing new servers and seeing them online. And the quote is, it truly is incredible. You can spin up 100 powerful machines in the cloud in just a few minutes, but you also pay dearly for the privilege. And then they continue saying that we spent about $500,000 buying 2 pallets of servers from Dell, which added a combined 4,000 vCPUs with 7,680 gigabytes of RAM and 384 terabytes of NVMe storage to our server capacity. This hardware is more than adequate to run all our heritage services we brought home together with Hey and give other Basecamp operations hardware refresh. And it was less than a third of the cost of what we predict we'll be saving every year. This is hardware will be amortizing over 5 years.
Yeah, it's a dramatic cost, but again, to be fair, they've never been 100% in the cloud, so they never lost that skill set within their company. Whereas other companies who have been, they're just 100% cloud DevOps, like they have folks that have never managed some of those lower layers that AWS and Azure and GCP are managing for you. That other side of the shared responsibility. So it's interesting to see. Clearly, I think it might make sense for certain types of companies, and they're pretty clear about that too. They're like, this works for us because, we're running services like this, and they're predictable, and they're clear about the fact that when they first started Hey, they had no idea what to expect. They had to do that in the cloud because they didn't know if they were going to get 1 million people signing up for an account on the first day or 1,000. Until they actually started putting out the press releases and stuff like that. Like I remember Dollar Shave Club, when they first went online, they came out with that just excellent advertisement that went viral. And within like the same day they launched, people were joking they were using dollar web hosting. That Dollar Shave Club was using dollar web hosting because nobody could sign up. Like the service just completely crashed. They couldn't bring on all that business. So, yeah, there's certainly a flip side to this. The other one here, I think I already went through this hot take. Maybe during the interviews today, I forget when it was. But I think everybody knows my hot take on, I think enterprise browsers and this is another thing, like by 2025, enterprise browsers 25%, blah blah blah, hockey stick up and to the right. I don't think that's true at all. I think this is going to be a niche product. You're not going to use it across the enterprise. It's not going to be on everybody's laptops. You're going to use it for contractors. Kind of same thing that we were talking about with Venn. Venn is trying to solve some of that same problem, just not by replacing your browser. But I think 99.9% of companies out there are just fine with Google Chrome and the enterprise features built into Google Chrome. And saying that, I do have to say that Google is a new sponsor of the podcast. So I've been saying that long before they were even talking to us. So I can point to episodes where I've said the same exact thing that I just said. So no influence from them being a sponsor.
I do think that we need to change both the graphic and the label on this, because it's not a hot take in any way, shape, or form. It's a smoldering take, because you've definitely been talking about this for a while. And so I think smoldering take is probably a little more accurate.
I like it. Yeah, and we were talking about validating the market before with Dan, right? Like how many, Katie, you brought that up with how many DSPMs, just coming out of the woodwork there are, and that does kind of validate the market. That makes it really feel like, this is going to be a thing if there's that many companies getting funded to do it, and we've not seen that with enterprise browsers. We've really only seen two main ones that have been heavily funded, and there's a couple of others in there that aren't really doing what they're doing. They're not building a new browser. I mean, that's extremely expensive to do from an engineering standpoint. I mean, yes, it's all built on Chromium, but to me, it feels very much like the Invincia Bromium days. And Invincia was smart and pivoted away and got a very good exit to Sophos. Bromium did not pivot away and got a very bad exit to HP.
I remember those days, and I remember both of them.
Yep. So I also wanted to, speaking of self-promotion, just mention this State of SaaS Security report that I put together for Valent Security with a ton of help. It wasn't just me. Tons of input from Yoni, our CEO, and a lot of awesome data collected by our research and product team from our early customers. Really interesting insights on what SaaS looks like in a lot of companies. And spoiler, there's just, I think we also talked about this earlier, there's just a lot of stuff that's not in use. Right? Like people will share stuff, people will spin stuff up, they'll connect their entire Microsoft 365 tenant, to some third-party integration, completely forget about it, that this third-party integration has full rights to do anything in their Microsoft 365 tenant. They can delete users, create users, see all the calendars, manage all the data. It's I think the average was 21 tenant-wide integrations per company is what we saw. That's one of the stats.
Based on what I've seen in Azure AD security assessments, yes, that tracks very well, including a lot of applications with the four most privileged permissions that you can have in an Azure AD tenant in just about every environment. So yeah, I fully agree and say, yes, we've seen the same thing.
Yeah, and then the last thing we've got here, our squirrel story, is a camera without a lens. And it's worth clicking on so you can see what the camera looks like. They really want you to know that it's a camera without a lens. They really draw attention to the fact that there's no lens by putting a not lens on the front of it. I'm not sure how else to describe the abstract art that's planted on the front of the camera. You kind of have to just see it. And the idea behind it is it's got GPS built into it and maybe some accelerometers. So it has a general idea of what direction you're pointing it in and where you are. And it's using generative AI to, I assume, combined with like Google Street View or satellite imagery or something like that. Like I have to assume it's pulling imagery from somewhere to kind of figure out what you're looking at and generate an image from that.
What is the problem that this is solving?
It's an art piece. It's not solving the problem. It's I don't know that they're not even sure if they're going to sell this. Like they built the prototype, but it's more of like a thought in an art piece. Like the fact that you can do it was reason enough to do it and to try it out. And I think the results are kind of interesting. It's kind of, I don't know, like you could have a camera that's basically like an impressionist, takes an impressionist version of what you would actually be looking at. If you don't want an accurate view of what you're looking at, if you want something that's, I don't know, more imaginative. It has dials on it. I don't know what the dials do, but apparently you actually can manage some settings on like what kind of output you're going to get. But they've got these 3 rings on 3 physical dials, allow you to control the data and AI parameters to influence the appearance of the photo. So, maybe one of them is like a DALL-E dial. It controls like how surreal the output is. I don't know.
It looked like one of the dials was date, so you can change the date and I guess pull from something that would be happening in that location at that time. But yeah, it definitely more of an art piece than anything else, because it certainly will not replace photography, but it's an interesting take on it. I think that's kind of a cool way to be like, all right, if you were in this place and you wanted to see what the weather would be like if it was raining, in a place where maybe it doesn't rain very often, it could be interesting. So it says the first dial behaves similarly to the focal length in an optical lens, but instead controls the radius or meters of the area the camera searches for, places, and data. Second dial is comparable to film grain. Third controls the guidance scale. Increasing guidance makes the AI follow the paragraph more closely. In the analogy of a traditional camera, higher the value, the sharper, and the lower, the blurrier. So I guess it's not date, but I saw date on one at the back of the thing. So I don't know, maybe there's additional options there.
Yeah, I would love the ability to customize this. Would be great. Like if you could make one of those knobs like completely sober at one extreme and acid at the other extreme of the dial. Yeah, just crazy hallucinations at the other end. That'd be fun.
Apparently the front is similar to the star-nosed mole. So it took the nose of the star-nosed mole and put that on there because it lives and hunts underground and finding light useless. So consequently, to perceive the world through its finger-like antennae, it has this unusual and intelligent way of seeing. So it can kind of see in the dark through these antennae, this nose, and yet it can't see any light or actually see through eyes. So the whole concept of this, I guess, is similar.
How much would you spend on this product?
$100 maybe, just out of a curiosity thing. I don't know. It almost seems like something you would do once just to see what it would be like, or maybe it'd be better as an app on a phone. I don't know. That could be kind of cool.
Yeah. No, this couldn't be an app on a phone, except, I mean, clearly he's going for, like, the knobs look great, like the tactile feel of the knobs and stuff like that. But realistically, I don't think anybody would, like, you'd get asked so many questions if somebody saw you with this star-nosed mole camera in your hands. But again,
it might be cool that they could do this. It might look kind of neat. It's different. It was an experiment. Yay for innovation.
Right. Depends on how much
does it solve. If it's art, it doesn't need to solve a problem. But if you're using it, it needs to solve some problem.
So, there's more information. Yeah, there's more information here. You can set the time of day, the address, the weather, the temperature, date or event, points of interest, and then text to image AI, and then you get the generated photo from that. So, yeah, it could be interesting. certainly we're seeing AI influenced in photography and post-production. So sure, why wouldn't it be part of the initial part of the process too? But I think it is very much like you carry this thing around. I don't know why. You carry this thing around, and then I would be more interested to have a website to actually plug in and see what that could look like, and maybe even take Adrian's perspective of like, all right, if this person was on acid at the time, what would they see if they were at the Louvre? Like, I don't know.
Don't like some of that, like TikTok and all of that, have filters that you can apply to that?
I have no idea what the TikToks is all about.
Me either.
Yeah, filters could definitely be part of that. That could be one of the dials, right? Yeah.
There's got to be an acid filter, right? If there isn't, whoever is listening, if you own a social media app, create an acid filter.
Yeah. Good stuff. All right. I think that's it for today. I think we're out of time. Thanks, Katie and Sean, for joining me today. It's been a lot of fun. And big thanks to everyone. Yeah, big thanks to everyone watching or listening to this week's episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. We do have Independence Day next week. So, just make sure I'm correct. Yeah, next week. We won't be here next week. We'll be back the week after. Bye-bye.